Good afternoon. Welcome back to UCSF Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, Chair of the Department of Medicine here. Welcome to our live audience in the department and throughout UCSF and our partners. As usual, we will post this video tonight at about 7 p.m. and I will tweet out the web address. To date, our series has gotten a little bit shy of 1.5 million views on YouTube. A few quick ground rules are up here on the screen. Put your Zoom window in full screen mode. If you have questions, type them into the Q&A box and I'll try to get to as many as I can. And we're now closed captioning all of these, so that's available to all of you right now. Well, today it's an interesting time. We're seeing a jarring juxtaposition of both the horror and the joy that comes from the vaccination process. The horror is very real. We're up to 310,000 deaths. That's a number larger than the population of the city of Pittsburgh. At the same time, one vaccine is currently being injected into shoulders at UCSF and around the country and around the world, even as we speak. And a second vaccine seems highly likely to be approved probably tomorrow. So that's certainly an occasion for hopefulness. Layered on top of this complex mosaic of the cases and the surge and the deaths and the vaccines is the fact that a new administration is coming to power. And clearly one of its early tasks is to get our core institutions back into a mode of placing evidence and science above politics. One of the most important of these institutions is the CDC. Yesterday, you may have seen an article in the New York Times in which the CDC's former chief of staff, who recently resigned, described an agency that had been sidelined and sabotaged by political types, leaving it unable to deal with this once-in-a-century pandemic. Every time that the science clashed with the messaging, he said, the messaging won. Well, we want to talk about that. We also want to talk, obviously, about the vaccines, both the practical details of the rollout and what is going to be a longer term, but likely to be a highly interesting and contentious issue. Can and should there be requirements of proof of immunity by the government, by organizations such as schools, businesses, airlines, restaurants, even healthcare organizations like UCSF. The mechanism to do this would be a so-called immunity passport. If you thought the debate about masks were complex, I would say you have not seen anything yet. So to cover this today, we have four terrific speakers. The first is our old friend, Julie Gerberding. I decided I wanted to talk about the CDC and about vaccines, and it turns out nobody solves that Venn diagram better than Julie. Julie ran the CDC from 2002 to 2009, where she dealt with a variety of threats ranging from SARS to the threat of bioterrorism after 9/11. Then after leaving the CDC, she went on to take a number of key roles at Merck, which is the fifth largest pharmaceutical company in the world, including for several years running its vaccine program. She's currently Merck's chief patient officer and executive vice president. Most importantly, Julie began her career at UCSF, where she was my chief resident. And when she was chief resident, she shared an office at San Francisco General with Catherine Lucy. And she, even as a resident, began doing pioneering research on HIV, particularly the risk of HIV from needle stick exposure. And Julie remains on our adjunct faculty and continues to come back to the county to teach every year. So I'll chat with Julie at the start of this about the CDC and vaccines and whatever else comes up until about 12:35. We'll then get to a brief update on the vaccine distribution process at UCSF. And for that, we'll hear from Desi Kotis, who is UCSF's chief pharmacy executive, and Susan Smith, our chief faculty practice officer. They have the difficult, challenging, interesting task of being in charge of vaccines at UCSF and how all this is working. And the vaccines have arrived and are being administered to people even as we speak. And I should say, by way of warning, if you see me leave this conference in the middle, it's because my magic email has arrived and I will be speeding into the hospital for my shot. We'll hear about how it's going and what some of the challenges have been and what the next few weeks are likely to be like. Finally, the issue of immunity passports will have something for everyone: legal issues, technological issues, political and policy issues, cultural issues, and more. Once some of us are vaccinated and some are not, particularly if the vaccine supply becomes plentiful, and some folks simply choose not to vaccinate, you can count on a level of controversy over immunity passports that will make the mask controversy look like a stroll in the park. To discuss this, we'll be joined by David Studdert, who's professor of medicine and law at Stanford and one of the world's true experts on the interface between the law and medicine. And David has written about the issue of immunity passport. So I'm really looking forward to hearing his thoughts on some of the legal, ethical, and practical issues that we are sure to get to. And David's segment will be from about 12:55 till 1:15, 1:20 when we will end. And I don't think you'll want to miss that. So thank you all for coming today. I think it promises to be a fascinating grand rounds. And let us start with Dr. Gerberding. So let's bring Julie back on.
Thanks, Bob.
Julie, welcome.
Really happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Let's start with the CDC. Tell us something about the CDC that the average person doesn't understand, doesn't know.
Well, one thing most people get confused about is actually the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So there are many, many centers at the CDC, including infectious disease. There's chronic disease, birth defects and developmental disabilities, environmental health, chronic diseases, and several others. So it really is the front line of the science of all of the components of public health that matter to people on the front lines.
And talk about pandemic preparedness. So when you were there, SARS broke. Was there a game plan somewhere? And was the game plan, did it anticipate something like COVID?
You know, SARS was a wake-up call that followed fast on the anthrax attacks. So we were very much oriented toward emerging infectious diseases, whether they were intentional or spillovers from the animal kingdom. And so when SARS happened, we had to mount a very large-scale global response. And we managed that sort of by hook and crook, rather than by having a preparedness doctrine that had been exercised and properly resourced. So after that, we got very serious about influenza based on the emergence of the deadly avian influenza spillover from time to time, which had a 50% mortality rate. And so that led over a couple of years to a very major investment in pandemic preparedness. And when I say major, I mean involving multiple countries, involving laboratory science, and most importantly, perhaps involving development of the strategic national stockpile to be able to support a pandemic response. And then the crawl, walk, run exercising, leading to full-scale functional exercises involving several states, just really, really honing our preparedness. And the other piece of that I think is worth mentioning is that Secretary Leavitt at that time went to every state, met with every governor, every education, faith-based organization, the leadership of the entire state multi-sector environment. And we did tabletop exercises in every state. So I think we leaned as far into influenza pandemic preparedness as you would probably expect any government to ever imagine, let alone execute.
And as you modeled this out in tabletop exercises, was there, sort of as you look back, was there something like COVID in terms of its level of infectiousness, its level of morbidity and mortality? And then, you know, it strikes me that as you described the things that had to roll out, testing had to roll out, PPE had to roll out, a communication strategy had to roll out. Was that all ready to go in a way? Was there a sort of, you push a button and you're ready to roll with it?
Yeah, the doctrine of really, I think, any pandemic preparedness is, first of all, the whole preemption, advanced preparation, countermeasure development, et cetera. But then it's detection. It's hopefully containment at the source, which takes a multilateral effort. If you can't contain it, then it's mitigation. How do you manage it when it arrives and deal with the healthcare surge and everything else that goes along with that? And then finally, the recovery phase. So each one of those phases had implications for the Strategic National Stockpile and BARDA. Each phase had implications for the public health system, the healthcare system, the educational system. And I've kind of been doing my own little miniature after action review to think about what did we miss, based on that planning that was done prior to, say, 2009. And I think there were two main areas. One was when you're practicing for influenza, diagnostic testing isn't very important. Because, we don't need an influenza test in the middle of a flu outbreak to know we're dealing with flu, or so we thought at the time. So we didn't put enough emphasis on how would you be able to roll out 300 million influenza tests simultaneously. I think the second thing was, while we were well aware of what needed to be done in terms of social distancing, school closures, shelter in place, et cetera, because those lessons were learned in the 1918 influenza pandemic, but we didn't have kind of the reach or the engagement of the legislative and appropriations side of the Congress to recognize that advanced preparation for how they would offset the economic consequences of those public health interventions. So that all had to be invented during SARS coronavirus outbreak we're having now on the fly. And we can see how challenging it's been in our highly politicized environment to really get the kind of support that people need.
Right. It's gotten more politicized, but I guess that was one of my questions. Did you anticipate that this tension between the economic engine and people's desire to have their normal life and the kind of libertarian streak in the country, which did not get invented 4 years ago, it's always been a thread. Did you sort of envision we're going to have to deal with that? Those are going to be cultural and political forces that have to be managed and dealt with.
We did, and I think history repeats itself. So the 1918 experience is very similar to what we're experiencing now in terms of the variability across jurisdictions, the pushback after people were exposed to what social distancing really meant to them on a family or individual basis, et cetera. So we had those concepts in our mind, and that's part of why we actually did more than tabletop exercising. We really did full-scale 72-hour functional exercises, including, for example, at Miami International Airport, practicing what it would be like to unload a large aircraft full of mock passengers and house them in the airport in quarantine. So we were very serious about trying to understand the implications of this. But what happens, it's crisis to complacency. And when the attention moved away from emerging infectious diseases, avian influenza went away, the 2009 flu outbreak wasn't nearly the catastrophe that we feared it would be. All of that focus and all of that energy got dissipated and displaced into other priorities. So that's kind of the tragedy of our long-term preparedness planning in America.
Yeah. I had John Barry on, the author of The Great Influenza, about 3 months ago, describing what that was in 1918, and the political parallels are really quite striking. You mentioned that one of the things that we probably didn't think as much about as we could have was testing. Is that because influenza, we had tests, and also if you could sort of screen people for symptoms, you were good to go? Is it because of this superpower that this virus has of asymptomatic transmission, asymptomatic carriage?
Well, clearly that's a big part of it. And, the fact that it spread so quickly, the hot spots just blew up very rapidly. So being able to detect where there was asymptomatic transmission became extremely important. And we just didn't have first of all, there was the initial challenge of not having accurate tests rolled out. And I don't have the inside story on what actually happened there, but clearly there were missteps. But then it was really the intersection between what CDC does with the Public Health Laboratory Network and then what FDA can do in terms of emergency authorization for additional diagnostic tests, and getting that whole activity cranked up and involving the private sector in it wasn't as smooth as it should have been. And I think we were way behind in terms of being able to have tests at the beginning where they mattered the most. Yeah. Once we were in the middle of this, the testing is probably less important. It's still a very valuable tool, don't get me wrong, but I think it's less important than it was at the very beginning when we were really trying to quench some very dramatic hotspots.
Yeah. Sort of talk us through the kind of issue of both uncertainty and changing scientific knowledge. So masks strike me as an example here. Obviously, the politicization of this influenced it in a major way, but one of the challenges, you come out in the beginning with your best scientific knowledge. Maybe schools are another one where we're thinking about them a certain way, and then we learn more and it changes the way we think about it. It strikes me we've done just a terrible job at messaging that, and some of that was partisanship, and people just hold on to the old message and sort of float it around to make a political point. But did you? I'm thinking back, if COVID had hit when you were head of the CDC, my guess is you would have been the public face of this rather than Tony Fauci. It probably, you would have had a much more prominent role than the CDC has now. How would you have dealt with the issue of messaging? And I've seen you do a lot of interviews, you're very good at it. What would you have been doing to try to get the message out, to deal with not panicking people, but to make them appropriately concerned and scared, to deal with the evolution of new knowledge and that this, we thought this 2 weeks ago and now we think that and it's different. How would you have handled this?
I'll just start by saying that, every leader has to have a line in the sand. Your principles, your ethics, your outlook. And before SARS emerged, I had a conversation with Secretary Thompson based on some of the complications that occurred around the anthrax attacks. And I just talked with him about what would the CDC role be, what would my role be, and how would we assure that science was the foundation of response to the next bioterrorism attack, which is, of course, what was on our mind. Long story short, Secretary Thompson agreed that CDC needed to be leading a public health emergency response. And so when SARS happened, the deal we had was that we would provide the science and translate that science into guidance and communication. We would meet every morning with the rest of the agency heads in HHS, and later on, of course, as it got bigger, the White House. And we would transmit everything we knew, everything we didn't know, and everything we were working on faithfully and transparently so that everyone was in the know, but the messaging was coordinated by the scientists at CDC. And I'm very biased, but I think that's the appropriate strategy. It is a whole of government response. So you're never going to pull it out of the administration or the Congress. You shouldn't, because it does take all the cabinets to be participating. But the science and the translation of the science foundationally is a public health effort, and it depends on the frontline public health leaders at the community level to be in constant communication, multi-directional communication. So I think the principles are, you tell people what you know, honestly, but you also reveal what you don't know or what your uncertainties are. And you explain to them what you're going to do to try to find the answers to those uncertainties, and that you promise to update them as you go forward. People don't expect you to have all the answers, and they don't even expect you to have everything right out of the starting gate, but they expect you to tell them the truth, and they expect you to consistently and consecutively keep them informed about what you're learning as you go. And if you prepare people for that, you have a much better chance of sustaining confidence and trust, and hopefully willingness to follow the recommendations that are emerging as the science evolves.
And how do you think about the recommendations in terms of kind of probabilities? Here's a common one. Should I touch the mail, or should I wash the packages, or all that kind of stuff? And of course, the answer is it's very, very, very safe, but the probability of getting infected from it is not zero. It's very close to zero. But as CDC, you've got to then come out and say that you either should do that or shouldn't do that. And the same is true of why 6 feet and not 5 and not 7. So how do you translate sort of risk thinking and probabilistic risk thinking into what you need to do is say, here is the guideline. If you follow this, that's the right call.
It's not easy. So, and people have different tolerances for summary statements or for, tolerating the uncertainty and the estimates. My approach usually, and I had to do this with many different kinds of outbreaks, and so not just SARS, but my emphasis was on what do we know? So we know that SARS is transmitted most frequently in hospitals when sick patients are undergoing aerosolized procedures. We have not seen evidence that SARS is being transmitted in schools or in community settings. So we just tell people what we know, and then you follow that on with a statement is we're studying it. If we learn something different, we'll be the first to let you know that we have to modify our recommendations. One of the things that I'm observing in some of the important communications that are coming out now or recently in this pandemic, really communications that are way too heavily oriented toward numbers and statistics and factual information. That's not what people really want to hear. They want you to tell them fast, be first with important information. They want you to be right as often as you can. And sometimes being right means you say, I don't know. They want you to be credible, which is what I just said about constantly updating and informing them. But mostly they want to know you care. And we are so missing that piece of the conversation in so much of the communication that's going on right now. When we get the medical community or the public health at the local level involved, then we start feeling like there's something tragic happening here. It's touching people's hearts, it's hurting their families. That's sad, it's frightening. That's normal under these circumstances. But too much of the time they're taking a very left brain approach, and it just moves people away from trust, I think. So it is, there is a science of emergency risk communication, and CDC has an amazing curriculum on this very topic that has been used to train emergency and public health personnel across the country, but it would be hard to know it watching some of the important media conversations that are going on.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to, I've wondered how you have felt as you've watched the CDC for the last 10 months, or is it sadness or anger, or what's your emotion watching?
All of the above. I have been, I've had to restrain myself. I made a decision early on that I was not going to get on cable news and participate in newsertainment on the subject, because I think that just adds to the confusion and the complexity. And I certainly didn't want to get into battling CDC directors or something like that. Right. So I tried to be influential quietly behind the scenes. But my main effort has been to try to work through the CSIS commission that I co-chair on global health security, and to use that platform and the incredible experts who are commissioners of that, including several Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate, to really have serious conversations about what do we need to do to make sure that this never happens again with our nation's treasury of public health. Yeah. That we have to look at structural changes, we have to look at budget changes, we have to look at government positioning. We have to really make sure this never happens again, because our nation can't afford to not have a strong central CDC, but also a public health system that's trustworthy and has the support it needs from the federal government.
Do you think on January 20th, CDC snaps back and becomes what it was, or do you think it's been permanently damaged?
I think it's been damaged, but I think as the stories are coming out, people are beginning to see a fuller picture of what actually happened and how the politicalization created such a barrier from the scientists being able to get the information where it needed to go. Now, it is also true, and we all know this being academicians at heart, that sometimes scientists aren't the greatest communicators. So, you know, you do need to have either some special training or a spokesperson who's especially adept at that. But that doesn't mean a politician. And so I think we've really learned that first and foremost, the CDC needs to be able to do its science. But second, when CDC makes recommendations or provides guidance, they are science-based. I know this, and it's the same scientists there today that were mainly there when I was there. So I know the quality and caliber of the science that they're doing. What they don't need is someone coming in who doesn't like where the message and the science has taken them and erasing all of the above. That just can't happen again. And we have to find structural ways and other ways to make sure it doesn't.
Yeah, I hope that happens. All right, we have 10 or 12 minutes left. Let's transition to vaccines. So I'm going to give you a chance to break some news. There have been rumors that Pfizer has been in talks with Merck to help ramp up its manufacturing. So I'll give you a chance to tell us, is that so or not?
Yeah, I'm not going to be making any news today, Bob. But I'm sorry about that. But I will say this: I think that this media has created this whole race to the vaccine, excitement in the news. But really, there has never been more cooperation across the biotechnology sector. Small companies, large companies, U.S. companies, international companies. The amount of information exchange, the collaboration around regulatory harmonization, the commitment to try to help each other out where we can. It's just unprecedented. And I think a story that I hope someday will be thoroughly vetted, because it is our industry at its best. The scientists are working literally around the clock. They are essential workers. They're coming in when the rest of us are working from home. And part of our mantra, at least in my company, is that we're staying home because the scientists and the people who make our medicines and vaccines need to be able to safely work. And the fewer of us there are around them, the more likely they are to be able to continue to do that. So no news, but the story is really about broad-based industry cooperation and science at its best, I would say.
And when you hear about the vaccines that are in development, I don't hear much about Merck. Is Merck working on this?
Merck has a couple of early stage vaccine candidates that we're interested in. One is based on the platform that we successfully used for our Ebola virus vaccine, Erbevo, which has been an important tool in the DRC in helping to quench the outbreaks that are going on there. And we learned a lot in the process of evolving that vaccine, which is actually developed by a small initially by Public Health Canada, and then a small biotech company, and then Merck. But the process of being able to develop a vaccine under emergency circumstances is a lot more complicated than people realize. So I think a lot of what was learned there in the collaboration, even among the three of us, the three companies that were working on Ebola vaccine simultaneously, it really kind of set the stage for a more successful engagement in terms of where we are now with COVID.
So you know this process better than probably almost anybody in the world. When you heard in January that this was breaking, in your wildest dreams, when did you think we would be having vaccines injected into people's deltoid muscles?
Yeah, I didn't think it would be this year. And I say that because I've been, honed in the crucible of the realities and risks of vaccine. It's a very high risk business. It's really hard to get everything right. And I just really admire the companies that were able to do this so fast, the courage, the commitment. All of us have put hundreds of millions of dollars at risk so that we can manufacture and not wait until we have approval. So the going at risk is also part of the story. And I think it's also important to talk about antivirals. We have a couple of those that we're progressing, excited about, but I think, if we had treatments that were highly effective or potentially could keep people out of the hospital altogether and that were available and could be globalized, that's another game changer. Because we do have to be thinking globally about the solutions here. It isn't just about what we can do in the US or Europe. So there's still a lot of work to do, but behind the scenes, I can tell you that I think there are something like 270 products that are currently in various stages of development as countermeasures for COVID. So there is an enormous outpouring of expertise around the world focused on this issue.
You and I were both at sort of the early days of HIV, and we don't have an HIV vaccine 40 years later. Did you think, you said you didn't think it'd be this year, did you think there was some chance we would not have an effective vaccine? And if that had happened, I'm trying to think about what plan B would have been if we found an effective vaccine.
Well, what I first worried about in January when we were first learning about this, is this a 10% mortality rate like SARS was?
Right.
Is it a 50% mortality rate like MERS? I was so frightened about the scenario of a fatality that, not that the current fatality rate is easy on anyone, but it could be so much worse with these spillover coronavirus. So that was my first worry. Mm-hmm. But I think my confidence is that we know a lot about coronaviruses. Compared to some virus that we've never seen before. There are animal vaccines for coronaviruses, for example, many of them. So it's a vaccinable pathogen, and many of the characteristics that allow it to be successfully contained with vaccines in the animal kingdom seem to be characteristics that carry forward into this beta coronavirus. So it's a very large virus. It is, in fact, these are the largest single-stranded RNA viruses that exist. And while most single-stranded RNA viruses, as we know with HIV and hepatitis C, have a great deal of drift so that we actually are infected with quasi-species, With the coronavirus that we're talking about, the drift is an order of magnitude less because the virus has a mechanism built into it to try to improve the fidelity of its replication. So it doesn't seem to be moving. It has a little drift, but nothing that is proven to be clinically or immunologically or even epidemiologically relevant so far, watching like a hawk. But that means it's much more likely to be a vaccine manageable virus because it's stable. That's something we don't know yet, but we are lucky, I think, that the spike protein is a great immunogen, but also it's maintaining its immunogenicity in a like manner as it moves through populations, even at this high rate of speed. Now, granted, there hasn't been a lot of immunologic pressure yet, and we'll also be worrying about that when we start using antivirals, especially if we use them as single agents. So more to that story down the road. I think the other thing that does concern me is the crossover into the animal species, which again is very typical of coronavirus, this cross-species transfer. But as we looked at the story of mink, how sad was that? But it suggests that we're likely to have animal reservoirs. And so we won't be talking about eliminating coronavirus. We'll probably be talking about how do we create a long-term immunology strategy so that we manage it like we do so many other vaccines that are pathogens that are susceptible to vaccination.
Let's talk about for a minute about safety and the safety profile, what we know, how long the patients have been observed. Let's start with the obvious question. Would you get vaccinated today if you had the option?
Well, here's how I answered this question. What we have right now is incredible efficacy information. So the benefit of this vaccine looms very large in my mind. We have 2 months of phase 3 safety information, which is sufficient to rule out dangerous short-term side effects of frequency in a sample size of several dozen thousand, 50,000 people, shall we say. Yeah. But we don't know everything we're going to learn. We won't know how many rare things happen. And I think we are operating with regulatory agencies that have demonstrated their ability to intervene when they see something worrisome and stop trials or pause trials. But they've also bent over backwards to try to be crystal clear about the criteria for assessing the benefit risk and then requiring the ongoing monitoring. So I acknowledge that we may have unpleasant surprises, but I think everything is signaling that these are really good and effective vaccines. And clearly the hazard for the people who are on the front lines and are being prioritized to receive this vaccine, in my view right now, outweighs the risk. So if I were a frontline health worker involved in the care of acutely ill patients, I would definitely roll up my sleeve to receive one of these vaccines.
Great. I guess I'll take your answer as if you were someone who could completely shelter and really create an environment where you think your risk is close to zero, you might wait a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you, I am so sick of sheltering in place.
I'm sure that's right.
I'm kind of thinking, when is it going to be my turn?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, mine is going to be a haircut. But yeah, I think everybody's fantasizing about what they will do once they've gotten their second dose. What do you worry about? You've talked about some of the things you worry about a little bit in terms of safety and what we might learn, and there may be a few surprises. What do you worry about in terms of the distribution process, sort of how the next few months are going to go?
I actually think about 5 hurdles with these vaccines. The first is efficacy, and so far flying colors on that one. Second is safety. We have short-term information and no signals about serious long-term things other than the allergy events with the Pfizer vaccine, but more to learn there. Third is durability. How long will protection last? And we don't know the answer to that. Probably longer than we thought, just based on the titers of response that we're seeing. But durability is an open question right now. The fourth hurdle is really, what will the virus do? Will it drift in an immunologically relevant way or an epidemiologically and clinically relevant way? Those are possible also. But then finally, the fifth is uptake, access, and distribution. And that's the hardest one. That's what we learned with our Ebola vaccine. And it's not just about supply chain, cold chain, logistics, cost of manufacturing, costs of movement of the actual virus and getting it administered. It's all the sociologic factors about affordability. It's about being much more oriented toward globalism as opposed to nationalism, and recognizing that the kind of cooperation that's going to be required to improve global access is heroic. And right now we don't have the global apparatus or the global commitment to really support that. COVAX is trying very hard, but I wouldn't say that there's confidence that the people in the poorest areas of the world are going to get the vaccine very fast at this point. I hope that changes. And then last and not least is trust and confidence in people's willingness to roll up their sleeves and take not one, but 2 doses of a reactogenic vaccine. And that's where we really need to restore trust in the people who are making the recommendations. And I think at the end of the day, the person people trust the most is their own clinician. Mm-hmm. So the frontline clinicians are absolutely imperative anywhere this virus is going to be utilized in providing that context, customized advice to patients with special needs or special risks, and really building back that trust in not just this vaccine, but vaccination in general.
Great. Julia, I will let you go, and we're going to move on to something that gets even closer to the ground, which is how this is all working here at UCSF as we roll this out. Thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for being such a good friend and friend of UCSF and the department, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks, Bob. Really, really an honor to be participating in this. Thank you. Thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you. It's very nice of you. All right, let's bring on Desi and Susan. And I think that's a fantastic way to set the context as you think about the big picture in terms of the vaccine. But now here we are, pizza boxes filled with dry ice and Pfizer vaccine sitting in our freezers, I guess. And it's Desi and Susan's job to figure out how to make it all work. So I think they're going to start with a few slides to show us what's going on and some of the criteria, and then we'll have a brief discussion about it. So Desi, let me hand it to you.
Thanks, Bob, and it's good to be here. Thanks for having us. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the distribution of the vaccine, and then Susan will talk a lot about what we're doing and where we're going in our next steps. So next slide, please. So as I said, talk a little bit about acquisition, distribution. Susan will review the prioritization of our employees, our first responders, and our patients, and then we'll talk a little bit about lessons learned. Next slide. So it's here. Vaccine's been distributed, as you all have seen, all over the country here in the US and in Europe. We have it here at UCSF. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the last couple of days. Next slide, please. So at UCSF, we received our first shipment, which was 975 doses, or equivalent to one 9 by 9 by 2 inch box. And we started vaccinating yesterday, our highest risk group. This slide was sent in this morning, but since the slide was sent in, we actually received the rest of our shipment for the week. So for UCSF, a total of 3,900 doses are being stored, and we will be continuing to vaccinate about 500. I think we have a little over 500 scheduled today, and that's sort of our cadence, at least through the weekend. As Bob stated, Moderna is going in front of the FDA today for emergency use authorization, and then the ACIP panel will review. So we'll hopefully know by end of day tomorrow if Moderna has a go. If that's the case, it will be a very similar cadence to Pfizer. We may receive the vaccine over the weekend, but conservatively, we are due to receive an additional 7,900 doses next week. So really, really great news when you look at those at highest risk for healthcare frontline providers and first responders. And again, there's a whole other community, including long-term care workers and residents. So a couple weeks ago, talked about all the intricacies, and this is a very coordinated dance. So takes a village. Susan and I are involved in leading a group of probably 100 leaders who are working in all these pieces, and she'll talk a little bit more about the process. But we have our vaccines stored in one San Francisco location and one of our locations in Oakland. They're both pharmacies. Again, we have pharmacists, pharmacy students, and pharmacy technicians on site who are handling and preparing. The Pfizer vaccine is a frozen liquid. It has to be thawed. It's able to be refrigerated for up to 5 days. And then that liquid needs to be diluted with a preservative-free normal saline. And then we are able to get 5, very rarely 6 doses out of a vial. So we are treating this and accounting for every single dose. We have these really cute portable freezers, portable refrigeration and freezer capability at our pop-up vaccine sites. And all the people. So everything went really smoothly, really proud of everything going on. Yesterday, we were able to vaccinate 220 people. And like I said, our cadence over 500 today and our cadence of 500. And we will be vaccinating on the eves of the holiday and the weekends around the holiday as well. Next slide, please. So as I talked about, we vaccinated yesterday on day 1, 220. We had 14 rooms going. Something important is that every individual who is vaccinated is observed for 15 minutes post-vaccination. Again, we could see that this, again, is old information. Things are changing even more rapidly than sometimes every hour. We had 238 scheduled as of yesterday evening when the slides were prepared. I think we're a little over 5 or 550 or 505. There's a couple fives in that number. So over 500 today are scheduled. So very few, I think 1 no-show yesterday. Very few of our first line providers, and again, those aren't just doctors and nurses, those are patient transporters and social workers and respiratory therapists, environmental health services, those custodial staff who clean for us. So we are really getting a great response. To Julie's point, people who are at the front lines are getting vaccinated. So you've heard about all the phases. You know, phase 4 is like the entire public without any sort of high-risk patient sort of categorization. Phase 1A is our frontline healthcare workers, our frontline first responders, and long-term care workers and residents. For UCSF, our phase 1A, I believe we will be done in 7 to 10 days. So again, this is if all goes well and we don't have any hiccups and our supply of vaccine stays consistent. So we took 1A and Susan will show you it's divided into 4 groups, so subgroups. And again, validating those lists with people to make sure we have everybody, we haven't missed anyone. So again, we're not looking at this just for those working in hospitals and ambulatory care clinics. We're looking at students, those on clinical rotation, researchers, those researchers who are actively working with the COVID-19 vaccine, our police force at UC, So again, sort of holiday season, we're looking at the list and checking it twice. We also are randomizing. I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Because the vaccine does have some really annoying side effects like high fever and fatigue and muscle aches and headache, in case some of our staff need to be out of work for a day or two because they're having these normal side effects of the vaccine, we are staggering. So we do have a randomization of these subgroups. And then, of course, right now we're actively working on who's in this group B, and that also includes high-risk patients. So with that, I will hand it over to Susan. Next slide, please.
Susan, you're on mute.
Thanks for that, and thanks for the invitation to join the Grand Rounds and talk a little bit about prioritization and actually administering. So next slide. So I thought I would start with why are we thinking about prioritization and what's the big deal about it. This data came from the Washington Post this morning. So the data in California is that at that level, we expect to receive 330,000 doses of Pfizer before the end of the year. And in addition, assuming that Moderna is approved, they're supposed to be shipping another 1.5 million doses before the end of the year. So the allotment for California would be 1.8 million. In California, we have 1.7 healthcare workers. I'm sure that's got some looseness in its definition, and another 640,000 nursing home residents and workers. Those would all be in group 1A that Desi was just describing. And it actually looks pretty close. We have almost enough vaccine to vaccinate that group. However, that's only 4.5% of the population of California. So we have a ways to go, and actually getting the dose to these people has some challenges. Next slide, please. So when we started thinking about prioritization, to me, it's interesting that during my career, I can't think of too many episodes in which we really had to prioritize a particular modality of care that we were offering. But COVID has just put that right front and center over and over again, starting with the PPE and then testing, remdesivir, and now the vaccines. So we have started a national conversation about this, which I think is interesting and complex and will never get totally resolved. But the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have weighed in on this, as well as the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and of course the CDC. They have established a set of principles, which I'll show you in a minute, and they've also done some risk stratification about who should get the vaccine first. So who's at risk for acquiring the infection, who has significant morbidity and mortality associated with this particular infection. Interestingly, how does it impact societies in our need for healthcare, food supply, transport, all of those essential workers, and who's at risk for transmitting it to others? Next slide. The principles that have been discussed and published include, importantly, getting the maximum benefit from this vaccine, particularly as it seems like a scarce resource. Equal concern for all people, which I think in this particular year is actually a totally important concept, as well as the other really important thing about this disease, which is doing our best to mitigate health inequities associated with this disease and other diseases. Next slide. So let me talk for a minute about what we did at UCSF in the process of prioritization. We convened a multidisciplinary team, and you can see the different areas that participated in this. We reviewed the UCSF cluster data to assess the risk exposure of different groups. We reviewed the national guidelines, of course, and then with all the other UC campuses came up with a set of priorities. They're not exactly identical, I'm sure, from one campus to the other, but the principles should be the same. Next slide. So Desi talked about phase 1A. Phase 1A is largely made up of healthcare workers and people living in congregated living situations. Phase 1B is largely patients. And in subgroup A, we prioritized those frontline patient-facing employees who have close, prolonged, and repeated exposures to patients with COVID-19, or those people who had prolonged and close contact with patients, even if we didn't know, but thought that they could possibly be at risk. And you can see from these lists that we have some in the hospital arena and some in the ambulatory arena. Next slide. We also wanted to think about, there's a lot of people in and out of those spaces, and who should we think about prioritizing? We wanted to make sure to prioritize those people who were closest to the risk of getting it themselves. We also wanted to think about people who, if they got it, would be at a higher risk, including those people who are in high-risk socioeconomic groups. So as you can see, we ended up saying, let's offer vaccination to everybody who is coming in and out of those areas. And I think Desi covered that a little bit, but I think it's an important and UCSF specific kind of recommendation of how important it is to make sure we're getting the vaccine to everybody. Next slide. So what are we doing and how are we doing it? So we had that list of, here's the people, here's the places, and we had to translate that into a database that we can work with. And the best database that we would have would be APEX. And we didn't, but that said, we didn't have all of our employees enrolled in APEX because they're not all patients at UCSF. So what we've done is begin to enroll across all of our parts of the organization, enroll everybody in APEX. We started with those people who are most at risk, and people started getting that message. If you were not a UCSF patient already, if you were a UCSF patient, you were encouraged to activate MyChart and look for messages. We took the top 4,000 or so people who were in phase 1, group A, subgroup A, those are the most at risk, and we randomized those and started sending them the tickets to schedule. And as Desi told you, they are actually scheduling. The plan is to we are open today at Parnassus, and we'll open Mission Bay hopefully next week. We plan to do about 500 immunizations at both sites. And Oakland opens today, and we'll also be vaccinating Oakland staff there. Our staff can choose, if they work in both places, which site to get the vaccine at. When you get your first vaccine, there's an automatic reminder set and sent to you at the appropriate time to schedule for your follow-up vaccine. Next slide. So next steps, I think Desi mentioned, we're starting to gather the list for 1B among the highest risk patients, and also other essential UCSF workers who were not already included. We also have discussions that need to get into more depth about our affiliates and with CDPH to understand what the community needs and what our role will be there, and ongoing discussion with the suppliers. Next slide. And then I thought I would just talk a little bit about lessons learned, and I can see we're at time, so I'll be quick. That task of taking a theoretical list of groups of people and translating them into actual names with email addresses turns out to be a completely mammoth task. We pulled it out of our HR data, which of course has many flaws. So we're busily fixing those lists and correcting who's in which category. Communication, almost always the most difficult part of any project, is really difficult when it's a complex project. Hard to find enough places to talk about this, enough languages to get translated into, and enough social media, web pages, email messages, et cetera, to communicate well with people. And then lastly, I sort of feel like COVID continues to get us with more unknowns than knowns. And this week it's about how many vaccine doses will we have and when will we have them. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about this, and happy to take questions.
Great, thank you. Maybe if Desi can come on as well. We only have a couple minutes, so this could be a lightning round. First of all, thank you both, and thank you to your teams for doing an unbelievable amount of work in a short amount of time under a lot of pressure. Probably the very definition of a thankless job, but so I'll say thank you. And also say that I have not gotten my email yet, which is terrific. I mean, it should be that, that if a patient transporter has more contact with a COVID patient than I do, that's wonderful. So I think the ethics and I think it says a lot about an organization, about how they do this kind of thing. So I think you've been doing a marvelous job. Pregnant women, yes, no, their choice. How's that work?
So for pregnant women, of course, it has not been studied in pregnant women. However, there are significant risks associated with COVID during pregnancy. The OB societies are putting out their own recommendations about it. And I think the recommendation is to speak to your OBGYN about whether you should have it or not, and weigh the risks and benefits. There may be some more data later about should we wait through the first trimester. So I don't think there's a final decision about it, but I think there's certainly an important discussion to be had between the risks of pregnancy with COVID with pregnancy versus getting the vaccine, which should be a safe vaccine. It's not a live vaccine.
Okay. If I'm supposed to work tomorrow, should I get it today? Or should I find a different day?
So my take on it is I'm going to try to have a day off possible the day after I get this vaccine, whenever that is. There's a fairly high incidence of fever and myalgias, and planning to go to work the next day is probably not ideal. It's one of the reasons, as Desi mentioned, that we randomize so we don't put the emergency room or the ICU or the RSCs out of business overnight.
Okay. You mentioned that people are going to be monitored for 15 or 30 minutes. Do they have the capacity there to give a shot of epi, or would someone have to go to the ER if they had an allergic reaction?
We have the drugs, we have the providers, and we have a process. So yes, we're able to administer diphenhydramine or Benadryl, and we have EpiPens there as well.
Okay. Maybe last one. You've mentioned that sort of this whole phase, just getting through the healthcare workers, and there are CVS and Walgreens are responsible for long-term care facilities, and they're doing that. At some point, that all ends, and there's a group that is patients, and some of them are our patients. So do we expect that we'll be doing a whole lot of our patients, or that will be mostly happening in the community?
Yeah, no, we're getting ready. There's a group that's already looking. That's what the 1B group is, and our highest risk patients and other essential workers are in that. So we do have like teachers that are in that group as well. So yeah, we're getting ready for patients, and hopefully that'll happen starting in the second or third week of January.
Great. Okay, and much more of this to come. I know you guys are going to be doing a ton of town halls as well, and there are websites with information. Is there any one website you want to tout now in terms of where people can get FAQs answered, or anything people should know about?
Ooh, should have given me a prep on that. There is a patient-facing website. I'll have to find it and put it in.
All right, if you do, and if you put it in the chat, I'll tell people. Thank you both. I'm sure we'll have you back again to see how it's going in a few weeks, but I really appreciate everything you're doing, and really, really important. Okay, let's move on to, thank you. Let's move on to our last segment, which may be the most interesting of all when you think about sort of the confluence of moral and ethical and legal and practical and cultural issues, and that is the issue of immunity passports. And our speaker is David Studdert. I hope David's on somewhere. Hi, David. Thank you for joining us. And I think David's going to speak with some slides in the beginning, and then we'll hopefully have 5 or 10 minutes to chat about this really interesting topic. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Bob. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, especially with such an august group of presenters. I thought I would start by providing some background on this topic. Next slide, please. So let's go back in time a little bit. Back in the late spring, early summer of 2020, this idea of immunity certification, sometimes called immunity passports, first surfaced and got a good deal of attention. At that time, the focus was on publicly or privately operated schemes that would be designed to certify people who had obtained positive antibody tests from a legitimate source. The certification would indicate that its bearer was fairly safe from reinfection or from transmitting SARS-CoV-2, and the bearers could present this certification to obtain relaxation on restrictions that they faced in their community. That was the idea. So certification, it was thought, would open doors to privileges, to work or to return to school or to mix or to travel or to congregate in order to worship in places where those activities were just not permitted otherwise. So the UK and several European countries considered introducing certification programs at that time, and it was reportedly under discussion in the White House for a period. Chile actually went ahead and launched an immunity certification program back in the late summer. So these developments provoked a flurry of discussion and debate. There was some thoughtful commentary, I thought, in support of the idea, but also, not surprisingly, some pretty strong opposition. And I would characterize that opposition as kind of coalescing around two concerns with these kinds of programs. And so again, we're back here in the late spring, early summer. Next slide. One set of concerns centered, you won't be surprised to know, on social fairness. The argument was that discriminating on the basis of immunity status was just wrong. Critics also pointed out that this is exactly the kind of program that history tells us is likely to be used to benefit the powerful and to disadvantage those without power, particularly minorities and the poor. Another chilling factor, again, back in the summer, was scientific uncertainty. Scientific uncertainty about whether positive antibodies really did confer protection. Was there protection for the recovered really, and for how long? None of that was really particularly clear. So immunity certification programs sort of receded as a policy proposal. And over the last 6 weeks, as many of you will notice, they've come roaring back. Next slide, please. So what's changed? Why the resurgence of interest in this idea? Well, a few things. Firstly, there's still a lot we don't know about acquired immunity following infection, but there is mounting evidence that it's substantial and real, at least for some period of months. Recent lab studies suggest that even mild infections produce a sustained viral defense. And epidemiologically, we've seen remarkably few clearly documented reinfections after tens of millions of cases stretched out over nearly a year now. Second, in the Bay Area, we're all too familiar with the crushing new round of shutdowns in response to the winter surge. And it shouldn't be surprising that people are starting to ask, why should I be subject to those restrictions if I don't actually pose a risk to other people or to myself as a recovered COVID case? And there are a lot of recovered people around that are asking that question now, about 17 million in the US alone. Finally, perhaps most importantly, vaccines are here. However, that is going to be a months-long rollout, as you've just been hearing, probably stretching for the general population into the late summer and fall. Should those people who've got their shots remain subject to public health restrictions, or should they be selectively released from them? If the latter, certification programs seem inevitable because we're going to need to know who is who. Also, from a policy standpoint, we might want such programs as a way of incentivizing eligible people to get vaccinated. Meanwhile, next, this is already starting to happen organically in the private sector. Some firms are developing smart technologies that allow recovered or vaccinated individuals to verify their status. Airlines are considering immunity certification to promote safer travel, and employers are facing increasing legal pressures to staff high exposure work sites with less vulnerable people. So businesses need a way to figure out who those people are. And now we need to be looking at much more than age and chronic illness, since immunity and vaccination is in the mix. So there are a lot of questions there about how all this is going to work. I'm sure we're going to dive into that in the discussion. But before we get to that, let me just offer thoughts on two questions next. What does the public think about immunity certification? And what about those fairness concerns that greeted the initial proposals? They certainly haven't gone away. So let me start with public opinion next. And next. So Mark Hall, a law professor at Wake Forest, and I asked 1,300 members of the public what they thought about immunity certification. This was a nationally representative sample, and our goal was to gauge levels of support and opposition, both to public schemes run by the government and private schemes run by businesses. Next, let me cut to the chase here. Views were almost evenly split. 55% opposed immunity certification programs and 45% of respondents supported them. Next, there was slightly more support for the private sector doing this than for the government. Next, and when we asked about particular activities, there were higher levels of support for doing this to allow returns to high-risk jobs and surprisingly to allow people to gather for recreational purposes again. Less support for using certificate programs to regulate a general return to work. So that's the bottom line. However, the most interesting thing about this study by far was when we drilled a little deeper and found that support didn't really gather along any of the lines one might expect. Next. Next, people who were at heightened COVID risk because of their age or health status or the job they worked at weren't more likely to support or oppose these programs. Next, and perhaps most remarkably, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents all split about the same in their support for these programs. Political leanings didn't appear to influence your view of certification. Now, I challenge viewers and listeners to think of another policy proposal around this pandemic in the United States that follows that pattern. There aren't too many. And as we've been hearing, this is a very deeply politicized issue. One explanation here is that immunity passport as a concept hasn't really become sufficiently aired for political or ideological camps to kind of form a position. It sits in a sort of pre-political embryonic state right now. Next, on the other hand, there were some differences by demographics. Women were about 35% less likely to support immunity certification than men were. Hispanics were about half as likely as whites. But interestingly, level of support among Black respondents was about the same as that for whites. Next, we also found some correlation between views of immunity privileges and other views that people held. I guess it shouldn't be surprising that about 70% of people who said they wanted a passport as soon as they could get one were supporters of the idea. On the other hand, a very common refrain among opposers was that this type of program could damage the social fabric of the community. Next, let me just finish by saying a few words about ethical and legal issues. Next, I think we can all agree that any program like this must be implemented even-handedly. Among groups of people who are eligible, such as the vaccinated, access to the opportunity to be certified must be fair and to the greatest extent possible equal. But we should be clear, at its core, this type of program discriminates. It discriminates in relation to a health attribute. And it was that feature of this idea that provoked a lot of the early criticism. Is that kind of discrimination illegal? The answer is probably not. If the programs are implemented even-handedly, there are likely, I think, to be few formal legal barriers to differentiating people based on immune status. We already have, after all, and we already accept other kinds of infectious disease certification for healthcare workers, for teachers, for international travelers. Courts have endorsed these rules in situations where the risk is substantial. That said, if history is a guide here, there are lots of historical reasons for worrying about a program that ties advantage to fitness in this way. Critics have warned that this will be a new form of social apartheid. I think the picture is a little more nuanced than that, particularly as we enter the vaccine stage. Any immunity advantages shouldn't create a permanent underclass here. They would be transitional until everyone has had a chance to be vaccinated. Secondly, it's already clear that the infection risk has tracked a familiar path, with racial minorities and poorer communities bearing a disproportionate burden. That should mean that antibodies are more prevalent in these communities if we go the way of certifying for positive antibodies. If that's true, then this could conceivably be a program that operates as more of a class leveler than a class divider. Similarly, we know now that bus drivers are in front of bankers in the vaccine queue. That's another reason to be hopeful that certification programs may have some progressive leveling effects. And finally, the programs will need to guard against fraudulent certification and deliberate infection. Incentives for deliberate infection pose an especially difficult problem if we're going to certify on the basis of positive antibodies. It's strange to be worrying about these problems. 9 months ago, all of this would have sounded like bad science fiction. But one way or another, it seems like immunity certification is coming our way. So we should be ready, and we should be doing what we can to help ensure our policymakers are ready too. So let me stop there, Bob, and open up.
Perfect, David. Thank you. We'll go for about 10 minutes because so interesting. First of all, congratulations on finding the one nonpartisan issue in pretty sure this is it. So does the moral and maybe even the legal calculus change once there no longer is vaccine scarcity? Once we reach a point, let's say in May, everybody's had an opportunity to vaccinate and the people that don't are making a choice not to. Does that change your thinking about either whether it's legal and whether it's ethical?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I definitely think it changes the conversation to an extent. I think that strong critics of these programs on fundamental grounds, and I'm not one of them, may still have some reservations because they may be concerned about why people who are eligible for vaccines haven't got them. For example, folks from backgrounds where there's intense mistrust of the medical system. We expect there will be vaccine hesitancy in those groups. If we're also then going to say that those groups will be, disadvantaged for lack of having certification, I think that's going to provoke some continuing concerns. My own view is that that's not a reason to move forward, but that we're going to have to be very attentive to those disadvantages, and it should give us even stronger reasons to try to educate the public about the value of vaccination, particularly against this deadly virus.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that one of the positive points about the passports might be that it provides an incentive, and there's actually a social good if more people do it and you reach herd immunity. That's a good thing. Do we know anything about how powerful incentive it is or would be? Are there empirical studies when something like this has been done in the past, or any theoretical reason to have a guess as to how strong an incentive it will be?
I mean, as so much else is true of this pandemic, it is sort of unprecedented in many ways. But I think that we can learn from other semi-mandatory vaccination programs around the power of the incentives that are provided by conditioning privileges on ability to get vaccinated. So a good one would be schools and daycare centres, for example. In many places, it's required to enter a public school or daycare centre that certain vaccination regimens are undertaken for kids. It doesn't preclude their ability to go to private schools where those requirements may not be in place, but certainly it creates a very strong incentive for people who would like to use those public services. Healthcare workers are another interesting group. For the most part, the United States has not had federal mandatory programs of vaccinations for healthcare workers, with a few exceptions. Rather, it's been left to recommendations by the CDC and to individual state action. But I think what we've seen there is that kind of approach can create some pretty strong incentives for folks to get recommended vaccines.
How much do you think this plays out in the government marketplace, and how much do you think it just plays out in the private sector? Uber saying all of our drivers are vaccinated and that's why you should want to go in an Uber, versus Lyft hasn't done that. Businesses doing it as almost both to keep their workplace safe and also potentially as a marketing tool for people to come into their workplaces?
Yeah, my guess is that the private sector is going to lead, Bob, and that we'll see a lot being done there in a pretty short period of time. But I don't think the government can avoid stepping into the game because, of course, it's an enormous employer and in some places the employer. So I think the government is going to need to be much more careful about the way that it proceeds. There are certain kinds of legal challenge, particularly constitutional challenges, that the government is subject to and private sector is not. So it has even more reason to be cautious. But I think that this is an area where the private sector is going to show the way. Will they get it right immediately and all the time? No. But I think there are some pretty strong incentives here to try to get this right for businesses.
Yeah, and one of the questions someone asked was sort of what is the threshold that, let's say a healthcare, let's say a hospital or healthcare system decides it's going to mandate vaccination, and it does that with flu vaccines, and that's gone to the courts. What do they look at in terms of, either the efficacy or the threat as a threshold effect to make it reasonable and allowable for them to mandate it?
Yeah, so there are two main reasons why courts have thrown out these kinds of requirements. One is that they're not implemented in a fair way. They're a sort of subterfuge to target a particular group, and there's been plenty of examples of that in history. But the other way in which they can be suspect is if they discriminate against a group for unjustified reasons, and so that can provoke an equal protection constitutional challenge, or it may be through sort of disability rights and disability discrimination law that a challenge is made. But for the most part, if the program is implemented for a good, legitimate reason and it's administered even-handedly, these kinds of programs in other settings have consistently survived challenges. And so I think we have reason to be optimistic for those people who support programs that they will be permitted. Again, as long as they're evenly administered and there's a good, compelling reason. And frankly, COVID is an extremely compelling reason to want to do this, both to protect workers and to protect our customers.
Yeah. Maybe the last couple of questions. Do you think it makes a difference if we find, right now what we know about the vaccines is they prevent you from getting sick and getting very sick. We don't know for sure that it prevents you from getting COVID and then spreading it. If it turns out that that is true, that it does prevent you from catching it and therefore spreading it, does that change the thinking here? In other words, if I haven't gotten vaccinated, the risk is really just to me, and what interest would a business have in keeping me out as long as everybody else is vaccinated?
I think it does change the dynamic. I think all of these factors, how much protection the vaccination provides, the extent to which it stops spread, they all go to the question of how compelling a case you can make for these immunity certification programs. And obviously, the stronger, the more certain, the more complete stoppage of spread, I think the stronger the case we have for these programs, and the harder it is to resist them for exactly the reason you say. Folks in that position will say, I'm ready to go. I'm not a threat to myself or to anyone else. And so the public health order that says I can't go is just unduly burdensome. And so it's another factor in many of these challenges against public health orders is the courts have said, look, is this the least restrictive order we can have for the population that is seeking to be protected? And I think there's a strong case, or there will be a strong case for the vaccinated to say, no, this is not the most restrictive because it's overly broad and unduly burdensome on a group that doesn't pose a risk to the community.
Yeah. You're an astute observer of American politics, having not grown up here. How do you think the politics plays out? As you said, the fact that there are, it doesn't parse on political grounds is probably an artifact if people haven't thought about it very much. But if this becomes a real thing, as it inevitably will in a few months.
I really don't know which the way this is going to going to break, Bob. I mean, I threw out one possibility, which is it's in this kind of pre-political state, but it just may be one of those issues that sort of crosses over all the usual lines. I mean, when you think about it, conservatives are extremely interested in getting business up and running as soon as possible. So that's an attraction. On the other hand, anything that's government or centrally controlled that requires, some impingement of rights, that's not going to be attractive to them. Liberals, I think, are suspect from the get-go about this, right? On the other hand, if the programs can have some kind of leveling effect, rewarding the bus drivers for the fact that they were in the front lines, got vaccinated first, and now can resume their valuable work, that's something that I think will be appealing to Liberals. So I don't know which way people will split on this politically.
It's fascinating. Well, you were a good academic and neutral analyst, but I'm going to push you, assuming May comes along, the vaccines have been out, people have had an opportunity to get it. Some people are choosing not to. Do you think this is a good idea?
I think it's a necessary idea. I can't see how, with a substantial proportion of the population vaccinated, but still ongoing infection because of the group that aren't, that we can hold back some selective privileging here to get the economy moving again, get people back at work. But I think we need to be really, really careful about how we do it. And, as I mentioned, history is strewn with bad programs like this that have been done for the wrong reasons. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Great. That's a good way to end it. Thank you, David, for helping us think through this issue. This is infinitely interesting and complicated. And as you say, it's really going to be important to get it right if we go in this direction. So thank you.
Good to be here, Bob.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to take a couple weeks off for the holidays. So we'll be back on January 7th for a regular Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. January 14th will be our next COVID Grand Rounds, and it will be 2021. So hopefully there'll be more good news than bad news. Thanks again to our crack production team. You see their names there. Those of us who are in the Department of Medicine, hope to see some of you on our holiday party this afternoon at 4:30. Otherwise, stay safe and happy holidays and Happy New Year.